Wonderful. Well, hello everyone, and thanks to you all for joining us at this webinar today. Today we're here to talk about the different considerations regarding organizational structures for creative districts. My name is Allison Espindola. I'm the Community Development Director at the Idaho Commission on the Arts. I'm a late 30s female woman with long brown hair. It's pulled back today. I have brown eyes and light tan skin, and I'm wearing a white and gray sweater with black sleeves. The Idaho Commission on the Arts, or Arts Idaho, is an Idaho state agency under the Office of the Governor, and we enable access to the arts education, and Idahoans' cultural and artistic heritage. With me today to talk about this are Rachel Morgan, Program Specialist at Nebraska Arts Council, and Annette Roth, Community Development Manager at Washington State Arts Commission. The Nebraska Arts Council is a state agency. They aspire to positively impact the lives of Nebraskans through the power of art. Their mission is to promote, cultivate, and sustain the arts for the people of Nebraska. And the Washington State Arts Commission's mission is to be a catalyst for the arts, advancing the role of the arts in the lives of individuals and communities throughout the state. Their vision is to see the arts thrive and are celebrated throughout Washington State and are woven into the fabric of vital and vibrant communities. They are also a state agency. So before we dive into today's conversation, just a couple of Zoom housekeeping. If you can all just make sure, again, keep yourself muted as you enter or as you're chatting. And you can find that mute at the bottom of your screen. Also, if you want to change your name in Zoom, please hover on those three little dots and you can change your name and maybe put your organization there, or continue to please share it in the chat so everyone can see who you are and where you're joining us from. Also, captions are available through the Zoom platform. You can access the captions feature by going to the bottom controls and clicking on Show Captions. The last item for Zoom housekeeping is to ensure you have access to and can find that chat. Most of you have already shown that you are in there and doing it, but that chat is really where you can put any comments and questions that for the three of us as we're presenting today. So if you haven't found the chat, go ahead and click on the chat icon at the bottom controls of your Zoom screen, and you'll be able to open up that chat, share who you are, where you're joining us from, if you're connected to a particular organization, if you'd like. All of that information is there for you. Another thing that we would love to know, that if you want to share in the chat, is in regards to today's topic, organizational structures for creative districts. What is it that you're hoping to take away today? So if there's something in particular that you're really looking forward to learning regarding organizational structures or support that you're hoping to find, please share that in the chat for us. That'll really help us as we guide our conversation, especially when we get to the Q&A. Today's presentation is part of a tri-state partnership between Idaho, Washington, and Nebraska. It's a virtual webinar that's facilitated by the three states and available to the public at no cost. This session is recorded and made available through an online resource library and emailed to all those that registered for this Zoom webinar. In addition to today's conversation, you can access recordings of our previous webinars, one about creative districts and rural communities, and one about community engagement strategies for creative districts. The three of us hosted that in 2022 and in 2024. So I'm going to share some links for you in the chat for those YouTube videos if you wanted to have some other references to go along as well. But thank you so much for joining us today. And Annette, if you want, you can go ahead and stop sharing for those folks. The format for today's presentation does include this lovely introduction for you all. But then we are going to break into three primary topics. The first one is going to be about governance structure and partnership types. Then moving into organizational structures and some considerations there. And then finally, succession planning and sustainability. I'll introduce most of those topics, and then the three of us are going to share information about each one of them before moving on to the last topic. After that third topic today, we are going to have time for Q&A before closing the event. So pop those questions into the chat as you're going along, and we'll answer them at the end, or you can wait to the end and share your questions then if you'd like. we do have a final question for you before you log off today. We'll pop it in the chat. So make sure to pay attention to that before you leave, because we would love to get your feedback. You're also going to get that email after this event that'll have links referenced today and things like that. So please make sure to keep an eye out for it. So now I can go ahead and introduce the first topic of today, governance structures and partnership types. And really, to begin, I wanted to dive into some thoughts surrounding, who should be involved, who should be at the table, and what can that really look like. So in 2022 in Idaho, we contracted with the Idaho Policy Institute at Boise State University to conduct a study partly focused on what are the governance structures of creative districts across the country. What's kind of that current process that's being followed? And according to the results of the study, actually, governance and leadership structures are usually asked to be identified within the creative district application. And many require a board or a committee with partnership organizations. Rachel will talk a little bit later about who leads that conversation, and Annette will talk about, volunteered versus paid positions. But based on these findings, just preliminary, Idaho has adopted the requirement that there needs to be 3 partners that are part of that first governance structure. One should be a representative of local government. One should be an arts and cultural organization located within the geographic boundary of the creative district. And then the other one is the flexible one. It can be anybody that the creative district chooses. And so there's more partners that you can have as part of this, but it's not advised to have more than 10. So to share a little bit of the reasoning behind that process that we have here, is, first of all, the 3 folks or more really is that rule of 3, if you've heard of that kind of applied in that sense. And it's really in the search of the highest level of operating efficiency. Fewer than 3 and the vision can get diluted. And the odd number helps prevent ties in the event of a vote. When the group of partners exceeds 5, the dynamic of the group gets really jeopardized. So think about it as too many cooks in the kitchen. Counterproductive behaviors impact the functioning of the team and the outcomes. It's easier to engage a small number of partners, and meetings can be easier managed. But that being said, the social sensitivity of the group combination is important to consider. So, for example, if 5 doesn't make sense, you really need that 6, 7, or 8 because of the social dynamic of your community, then bringing them in is a realistic opportunity, especially here in Idaho. Meeting management also can be a little bit of a challenge. So making sure that team engagement and meeting management are at the foremost. The larger your group gets beyond that 3 to 5 window, the more that you really want to start getting really specific about how many folks you bring into the table and how you run a meeting and how you engage each team member so everybody has that voice at the table. And then finally,
just mute yourself if you don't mind. Thank you for people who are joining us. Please make sure that you're on mute.
Thank you. And finally, the reason for the mix of local government with arts and cultural organization is so that kind of both sides of that coin are satisfied or are recognized. Making sure arts and culture are part of a creative district is really important. We want to make sure that the local voices are a major driver in the decision-making in that district that they're operating in already. And then the local law and policymakers, they should know what's happening, they should know what's occurring, and they can also make sure that the legal activities are taking place, that there's policies and processes in place that allow for the functioning of the creative district in that area. And then the last thing I want to mention before I pass this off is really geared more for those of you joining us today that are part of a nonprofit that want to be involved as a partner in a creative district. So for those of you that want to be in the leadership or administration of a creative district. However, if that's not you, this is still important information because you don't want to get too far down that planning path and then realize you can't have the partners at the table you thought you had. So for those of you in the nonprofit realm, the first thing you need to do when considering getting involved with a creative district is to check your bylaws. According to the rules that you set forth for your organization, can you legally and feasibly participate? And if not, you need to change those, you need to amend them prior to agreeing to be a part of the creative district. This can get into quite a sticky situation if you don't do that step first. Now, hopefully you and your board are already reviewing your bylaws and amending them frequently and as needed. And ideally, you're ensuring that they're user-friendly and written to communicate with a variety of your audiences, like board members, administrators, funders. So hopefully that's already a process that's taking place. So it's a way that you can already make sure that, oh, these bylaws are amendable, we have a process in place, and you can make that change quickly. If you haven't had that yet, so if you are not familiar with your bylaws or you haven't amended them or there's not a workable system in place to amend them, that is something that you're going to want to work through as an organization and then make sure that you can have it in place that your organization can participate in the creative district and then participate. So make sure to follow those steps, really find that workable system to amend your bylaws, to allow that participation, and then join the governing structure. If you do need to make a major overhaul, again, just make sure that it's a workable system, you make those bylaws user-friendly, that they reflect your organization and its mission, and then make the changes as you need. So with that, I would like to pass this over to Rachel to share more about her thoughts on who should be at the table and who that lead person should be.
Thanks, Allison. So in every district, you're going to have an organization who ends up taking the lead role. Sometimes it's a natural and uncomplicated issue, and sometimes it takes a lot of discussion to decide who that entity should be. Here in Nebraska, with our creative district program, we call that entity the district administrator. That entity must be identified before a potential district can even send in a letter of interest for the program, because it's that important to the program. It shows that the community has been thinking about the logistics involved with the program and that conversations have been started. So when you're deciding who is going to be that lead organization, there are some things to consider and think about. One, do they have the organizational capacity to do what is required? In our program, the district administrator is the organization that receives the grant funds for the district and is responsible for the reporting that is required. So does that organization have the capacity to manage the grants and complete the reporting? It can be time consuming to research the reporting. So do they have the time to dedicate to that? Another thing to think about is, does the organization, is it all volunteer led or do they have staff? We're going to talk about this later on in another area, but it's something to think about in regards to the lead organization. If the organization has staff, is their plate already full? How is it going to impact the job that they're already doing? Another thing to think about, if the organization is all volunteer led, how much time is this going to take from the volunteers? Again, do they have other things that take precedence? So the work of the creative district will fall to the bottom of their to-do list. If the organization is receiving grant funds, will that organization be required to provide an audit now that if they're receiving more grant funds? Is something to think about. If this is something new that they haven't done in the past, are they ready for that step, both organizationally and financially, to pay for an audit and be ready for that? If the lead organization is the city, there are also some things to consider on that end. Just like a nonprofit, who will be the lead person who is responsible for the work that is required? Is this something that is going to be added to their workload that they already are full? The city governments will many times need approval before any payments can be made from grant funds. So this may slow down the payment of a project as well, if they have to take it to a city council meeting to vote on the approval of payments. The good news is that most of the time cities are financially transparent and they're already required to do an annual audit, at least in our state. The other nice thing is that cities usually have multiple staff people. So if there is some staff turnover, there's usually someone that can take over for the reporting of the district, or at least for a little bit to fill in while they find someone else. Overall, the thing to think about is the lead organization should have the trust of the community. If the potential district feels concerned about the organization spending the funds the way the district wants, they should have this conversation right away at the beginning of the planning process. Don't wait until the grant funds have been awarded to then voice concerns about who is going to administer those. And now I'm going to hand it over to Annette.
Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate that. So I want to talk a little bit more. We're going to expand on this notion of who's the administrator and what does it look like to run the district, from the position, from a staff position, potentially. So here in Washington, our districts are run similarly to Nebraska's in that we have an organizational administrator that does the reporting, that takes on the bulk of the activities, but we don't require that creative district administrator has a paid staff from the beginning, from their inception. We know that this can be challenging for communities to do, particularly for small and rural communities, to be able to fund positions like this. And so we don't want to set up barriers to them becoming a creative district. In Washington, some of the communities, particularly the ones that create new nonprofits for their creative districts, run their districts with their board essentially doing a lot of the work or all of the work. Other districts, particularly those where an existing nonprofit takes on the management of the creative district, they'll just shoehorn those activities for the creative district into an existing position. This also happens pretty commonly at cities as well. We only have one district that actually planned to have a fully dedicated staff from the beginning. Most of them have kind of worked it into an already existing system. Now, all three of those kinds of models could work from in the beginning stages, especially when folks want to get things moving forward, right? They want their program plans to start beginning. They might not have a very big budget in the beginning, and it is a low barrier for them to be able to do that. However, what we see over time is that this becomes untenable as work products and projects become more complex and that the creative district initiatives require more time and energy, especially for districts in communities or in organizations where they were shoehorned into a position, there becomes a challenge with competing priorities and what should be focused on. With the board model, what we see, it can be difficult for all of the board members to keep moving in the same direction and keep to the plan. Volunteers will get burned out or take time off. Oftentimes we see that they go on winter holiday for several months, or the board makeup changes or some other kind of shakeup can happen. And so it can be hard to keep the momentum rolling and also, focusing moving forward. Sometimes we see that board members may have their own pet projects that will try to insert them into the process, or folks are starting to jockey for position or dominance within that hierarchy, which can be challenging, right? That said, if we have group cohesion, we've seen that those kinds of collective models of activity can work for quite a while. But what we're seeing now here in Washington is that over time, most of our districts are moving to either a fully paid position model or to carving out a specific set of job duties within a specific role, for example, at a city, right? So they will make that be a big part of a person's job position. Obviously either one of these is optimal, as this means that one person or team is dedicated to moving the district forward and there's one line of hierarchy and responsibility for this. And we know that this can take time to get there. You know, like I said, some of our districts are 3 or 4 years old, and they're just now moving into this kind of a model. So if you're in that place, or we want you to think of a couple of things as you go through this. The first is that you should start planning for this from the very beginning of the process, right? So if you're in the planning stages of your creative district, even if you can't have a paid staffer available when you get certified, you need to make space in your 5-year plan to make this happen, you know, and so that requires you doing research about what a position like this is going to look like. You know, a staffer within an organization or at a city is going to be very different than having an executive director type position for an organization. It's important to think about how much time is realistic. You know, oftentimes when you have a group of board members doing this work, you know, you might have 5 or 10 hours per person, but if you have 6 or 7 people doing that work, that very quickly becomes a full-time position. And so if you were trying to think about hiring a person for 10 hours a week at $20 an hour, that's not really a realistic model to make sure that your district can maintain its level of activities. You're going to want to think about things like benefits, vacation, healthcare. You know, the district administrators are professional level positions that do require a lot of high level skills, and they should be compensated as such, right? And I know that can be challenging to get there, but it is important. You know, the quality of the work that comes out of those positions is determined by the quality of the applicant pool that you can have for those positions. Another thing is to think about how this position, particularly for nonprofit organizations, how this new position is going to interface with the board. And oftentimes, this is the most challenging part of the transition to having a paid staffer. So, you know, especially for those districts where the board has been collective in their decision making, it's difficult sometimes for them to be willing to cede control and decision making over to the staffer. But if you don't do that, it undermines their authority and causes confusion for partners, for funders, and then also even amongst the board itself. And so this part of it goes to board training and development, which we are going to talk about a little bit further on in the webinar. You know, having a paid staff position ultimately to help you run your creative district is going to ensure that your district is as effective as it can be in helping to make a difference in the community. So that's something to think about as you're developing your organizational structure. What is that going to look like? Allison, over to you.
Thanks so much, Jeanette. And you did a great job of kind of setting up our second topic, which is talking about the organizational structures and some of the considerations there as far as what is that going to look like when you set up your model? And, you know, sometimes I feel like choosing an organizational structure can feel like choosing a drop of water out of the ocean. It's overwhelming. There's a lot of debate about different types and models and methods to the madness. And with our research with IPI, we found that organizational structures vary from state to state and even district to district. So it found a few really interesting things, because I know that is not helpful for those of you that might be like, well, what do I do? And there's really no consistent model from one place to the next, because it is really made to be responsive to what it is that's going on in your community. But there are some things to consider. So for example, most states do allow districts a good amount of autonomy in their structure. You are able to make those decisions that are best for your particular community and your partnerships and your needs. Government-led or nonprofit-led are the most common types. And Annette just touched on that a little bit as far as, you know, maybe it's a government position, a local government official that's stepping into this role and taking on some of that leadership, or maybe it's a nonprofit organization that already exists that is now creating a new arm or a new organization because of it. And also good news in the findings was there's actually no clear indication that one type of organizational structure is not more effective than another. So again, making those really informed decisions about what's best for you and your needs in your community is really the best indicator that you're choosing an organizational structure that's going to work for you. Where I do want to tip a little bit further into that, though, is the difference between flat and I always mispronounce this, so you're going to hear me say it 5 million different ways, but hierarchical structures. And those are the two most common structures. The hierarchy organizations are more top-down, with decisions made at the top, and they flow down to the lower levels. And flat, or sometimes called horizontal structures, on the other hand, are more decentralized, with decision-making power distributed throughout the organization. So with the hierarchy, it's the traditional pyramid. So you might be very familiar with that structure. There's clear power structure. There's chain of command from the top to the bottom. The board usually is at the very top, and then decisions are moved from the CEO or the executive director to the other higher level execs, and then down and down through general staff. There's very clear roles, dedicated responsibilities, and it makes it easy and clear to contribute to and produce work in a disciplined manner. The other structure, the flat structure, is where a small group of staff share the authority and responsibilities of the company. Most startups or new small orgs adopt this management style primarily because of a lack of resources. Once the organization starts to grow, it may switch into more of that hierarchy over time. But overall, the flat or horizontal structure has few layers of command, and managers have a wide span of control across different areas of an organization or of a partnership. A lot of modern companies are beginning to implement flat rather than hierarchy structures. It gives a little bit more freedom to staff members. It creates an atmosphere of transparency, of cooperation. There's less supervision and more staff involvement. It can generate feelings of value and commitment amongst everybody. It also allows for really great flexibility as far as being able to have the organization, the creative district, bring together all of the people working on it to contribute to a specific task or project relatively easy. So based on those two descriptions, and feel free to throw your hands up in the air or use the hand icon, how many of you were like, yes, that flat description sounds fantastic. I love it. That's the way to go. Because when I read that, when I hear that, to me, that's like the ideal dream where everybody has this, distribution of influence, and everybody has kind of that even level playing field, right? I would caution, though, that while on paper that sounds lovely, in reality and in application, it typically doesn't work out that way. First of all, with a creative district, it's already not a small organization by nature. You have partners that are typically coming in that have organizations that are backing the initiatives, right? So a government representative typically will have the rest of, the local government structure supporting those initiatives. So those resources are behind them. And then a nonprofit leader, you're going to have the same type of impact. So you already have a lot of voices coming to the table, lots of people that can be involved doing lots of different things. And then also, if you are primarily or fully volunteer-led, a flat structure is asking a lot of those volunteers. There's no clarity on who somebody is reporting to. So there's who's making that decision, who gets to make the ultimate call on something, and what is a person's role in all of this. You would spend a lot of time as a creative district structure trying to define all of those little pieces, which can really burn out and frustrate your volunteers that are coming to the table. We do have our first creative district here in Idaho, the West Central Mountains Creative District, and they tried the flat organizational structure with an informal partnership. So they started off with 3 primary entities, one from economic development, one cultural and artistic nonprofit, and one individual artist. And as the initiative grew, so did the partnership, bringing in more people to the fray. And there were some really interesting challenges that popped up that I felt they faced with having that flat model. And really, the first one that came to mind was, who makes that final decision? Who is overseeing the ultimate vision of the creative district, and who's coming together to make sure that that initiative is continuing to move forward and making the call? Sometimes in that flat structure, everybody's looking at the other person of, do you get to make that call? Do I get to make it? Who wants to take responsibility for it? And there's a lot of this round robin, not sure what to do. The other thing that I noticed was, I said the squeakiest wheel gets the attention, right? So the person that's speaking up, that's maybe more extroverted or more dominant, more outspoken, they tend to get their initiatives pushed forward. And if there's money involved, they tend to get the money to go forward with what they're wanting to do and what's important to them and their priorities. And those that are quieter or more introverted or less confrontational start to take a back seat. So they start to create their own informal hierarchy amongst this flat structure, just based on personality types and leadership styles. And it may not be the best outcome for your creative district to have that particular extroverted person driving the train, when the introverted person that maybe took a back seat should really be a dominant voice in that conversation. So that's something to really keep an eye on with those flat structures. And the last thing that I want to mention that can be a really interesting challenge that pops up through creative districts, and kind of what I've seen, is that mission drift. So over time, based on new players that come into the table and no clear group that oversees that initiative, it's very likely and possible that you can start drifting. So just keeping that in mind about what structure you want to choose. And while Idaho is not requiring a particular type of structure or anything like that, it is important that these conversations are had amongst groups to really decide who's going to do what. And very similar to what Nebraska and Washington offer and require is having that district administrator who's that primary point of contact between the state agency and the creative district. So while they may not be that chief decision maker officially for the creative district, they are the person that's going to be in communication regarding decisions and the direction of the creative district. So with that in mind, I want to pass the conversation to Rachel to talk about roles that she recommends for creative districts and organizational structures.
Thanks, Allison. And Allison, don't feel bad. I also cannot say hierarchical. I can't do it. So you are not the only one on this call. So I want to talk a little bit about roles in your creative district. What kind of roles do you need? As you go through the planning process, one of the things that we learned in Nebraska is to set up your organizational structure early on. Don't wait until you're certified to have these conversations. And we learned that the hard way. Some of our districts who are certified early in the program will tell you that. We learned it from them, that they stalled out after even receiving grant funds because they didn't have a clear organizational structure and who was responsible for making those decisions. We thought that would just kind of happen naturally, and we learned that is not the case. So depending on your structure, you could have a point person who is a volunteer. If you have an organizational hierarchy structure, you might have a board president who changes out every few years. Or you might have a paid staff position who can make the financial decisions. Oh, see, I see Annie popped into the chat. See, Annie's one of those that can attest to deciding this early on. Perhaps the paid staff position has the authority to spend up to a certain amount, and then they have to have executive approval. I will say that we have found, and even research has shown, that districts with paid staff positions tend to be more effective, and this makes more sense, right? It makes sense logically. They're literally paid to focus on the creative district. And Annette talked about this in the first section. If you have a staff position, be clear with them about what those expectations are. Are they responsible for just completing reports? Are they responsible for doing fundraising? Are they responsible for programming decisions? Just be very clear about what those expectations are so that they know, so everyone's on the same page. As your district grows, are there other roles that you will need? Will you need someone who solely focuses on marketing and graphic design, or is this something that can be outsourced? Do you need someone who has grant writing experience, or are you planning on outsourcing that as well? The main thing is to come to a consensus on who can make those financial decisions so that projects can move forward. From my experience here in our state, everyone can be on the same page and get along. And then when money becomes involved, it can get a little weird. People can get territorial and want to be in a position of leadership. And so that's why I highly encourage districts to decide early on who makes those decisions and how that organizational structure will be set up. Goal is to work through those difficult conversations before becoming certified, so everyone's on the same page. We know that things are going to pop up later. So having those big decisions and those difficult decisions early on and having those decided will allow you to spend your time more effectively than down the road as other things come up and you can work through those. I am going to hand it over to Annette, who is going to talk about committees and what that may mean for your district.
Thanks, Rachel. So when building out your organization, it's important to think about what are the types of activities that need to happen in order to grow your district. Activities like marketing, planning, programming, fundraising, grant writing, partnership development, economic development. How is all this going to get done, right? Even if you have a paid staffer, it's not realistic to expect that person to be able to do all those things, or if they do all those things, to expect them to do all of them extremely well, right? And so this is where having a good committee structure can support the work of your district. In Washington, when communities start working on becoming a district, we recommend they start to do this from the very beginning. So our planning process here is guided by our Community Readiness Toolkit, which has specific topical areas such as marketing and economic and workforce development, And so you can make plans for all of these things, but unless you have people driving these plans forward, they're not going to happen over the long term. So let's take marketing, for example. A big piece of the growth and sustainability of your district is getting visitors and potential residents or new businesses to know that it exists. So how are you going to do that? Who are going to be your target markets? How are you going to measure your reach to them? And how many resources or how much resources are you willing to put into this so that you can reach those markets? As state agencies, we can only support this work so much. We are government agencies, not marketing firms. And so some of the work of that marketing and outreach does need to fall to your district. Having a group of folks to support that work is going to be helpful, And so that said, having a marketing committee can act as a support to the staff people running the creative district. The committee doesn't necessarily drive that bus, but they help them to determine what those priorities are and how they need to move things forward, right? And the way that works successfully is that committees know what their roles and responsibilities are from the very beginning, and making sure that the committees and the staff can be entrusted to those roles that they have and to do their work is key. Trust, transparency, and accountability are all key factors for any committee to be able to move projects forward. And that's the basis for all of the work that these creative districts are doing. We're trying to do community development in a more grassroots and holistic model, not top-down development, right? So being able to do that is tied to the strength of your organizational structure, which we already talked about. And so there are some things to think about as you try to develop your committees and, a couple pitfalls potentially to avoid. So one thing to be aware of when creating your committees is groupthink, right? So if everyone on your committee looks like you and thinks like you, it's likely that you're going to fall into groupthink. And so for those of you that don't know what groupthink is, it is a way of thinking where members of small groups tend to accept a viewpoint that represents a perceived group consensus, whether or not that is actually true. And groupthink reduces the efficiency of collective problem solving within these groups. Oftentimes we'll see a committee is led by a person who's an expert in a topic, right? They may have done that for their career or some other kind of thing. And, obviously that's great because they know the topic, so they can provide context for folks who may not be as familiar with it. But, just because someone is an expert or they've been doing something for a long time, it doesn't mean that they know everything about that particular topic, nor does it mean that their ideas would be most effective for the conditions that you have set in your community. So it's important for groups to be open to new concepts and to allow for respectful discussion and be open to experimentation and recognize that just because we've always done it this way doesn't mean that that is the best way, right? And so it's important to look at different perspectives. And one way to avoid groupthink is to bring in a diverse set of committee members for each topical area. Getting community members and partners involved. It's important to have the sort of experts at the table, but it's also important to have people who are looking at it from a different perspective or who come from a different approach. That's when you have a broader sense of possibilities and you can actually come up with better solutions over time. One thing to keep in mind is that the staff person who is working on this, if you have a staff person, should always be involved in one way or another in these conversations or be appropriately briefed so that everybody is on the same page. If you have these committee meetings or board meetings where the doers are not involved, first of all, that's not a best practice, but that's also to us as state agencies is a red flag as to an ineffective organizational structure for your organization. And so that's something that we look for and we try to help folks navigate through that if we see that they're running into those kinds of issues. So now we're going to go to our final topic, which is talking about succession planning and sustainability of your organization. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison, who's going to kick us off.
Yes, thank you so much. And with respect to time, I know we are getting close and I want to make sure we keep some time for that Q&A at the end. So I'm going to cover some brief points about what the succession plan is and what it should be doing, and then pass it right off to Rachel. So first of all, the goal of succession planning is to ensure a smooth transition after a key partner moves on. It should reduce negative impact of sudden leadership changes, make it easier to get board and shareholder support, minimize miscommunication, minimize chaos, and help preserve the knowledge and expertise of your creative district. So how do you do it? There are 5 really key steps that I would love for you to consider and remember. The first is you should identify those key positions or partner categories. It's really similar to what Rachel was talking about in regards to defining the roles, or what Annette was talking to in regards to defining the committees, but making sure that, these are the broad categories. And then within those categories, what skill sets are necessary. So making sure that you really identify pretty clearly what those skills need to be at the table to deliver in that particular category. And then looking at the people already in place, who is there and who might be able to step into a different role based on the skills they have or the experiences they have. So could they potentially move into that? And then you need to create your plan. This transition plan should be formal. It should be comprehensive, practical. It should be aligned with and tailored to your creative district. But it needs to be a plan of how one person will step down and how one person will step in. And especially navigating and designing that in the beginning will be really helpful, that as those key partners have to transition out, because it may happen sooner rather than later and sooner than you expect, having that set there so that you can step in and people know how they're going to remove themselves and how somebody will come into a role is so critically important. And then being able to train people about the succession plan. Let your board know, let your volunteers know, this is really what this process is meant to look like. That way there's no surprises. Everyone can kind of have an idea of what to expect as people are moving in and out of your creative district leadership. And then finally, you want to implement your transition plan when it's needed, and then constantly be evaluating and adjusting it accordingly. So making sure that you follow up. How did that removal from that position go? How did you transition out? How was that experience? What could change? And then when you stepped into this role and onboarded, how did that transition in go? And what would be better for the future? So making sure that you would look at those different strategies when you're creating the succession plan, because that really will set up your organization, your creative district for success and sustainability for the future. So with that, I want to hand it over to Rachel to talk about the board's role in all of this.
Thanks, Allison. I love board development and training. I'm not gonna lie, it's one of my favorite things. So knowing that and also editing myself because we have a time limit, once I am done, I am gonna pop quite a few links into the chat so you can follow up on some of these if you are interested. But there are multiple trainings, booklets, webinars, resources that are out there. So online there is websites called Board Source, Blue Avocado, which is a really funny name, but is really great. There's also a National Council of Nonprofits. So those are different online resources. And like I said, I'll pop in links. Other things to think about is to check in your community. Are there organizations in your state that provide training and resources? Here in Nebraska, we have the Nonprofit Association of the Midlands, which we call NAM for short. They're located in Omaha, but they do serve the entire state, and they have a training called Board Masters. It's about 5 hours long and it covers a lot of material, but it talks about things from board recruitment to 990 filing requirements. So there is a lot that is packed into there. For arts organizations, you could check with your regional arts organization. In Nebraska, we are a part of Mid-America Arts Alliance, and they offer a program called Engage, which provides community-centered professional and organizational development, which focuses on leadership training for small to mid-sized arts and cultural organizations. I personally went through an iteration of the program many years ago, but it was incredibly helpful. And it really helped the organization that I was with define board roles, write job descriptions, and that type of thing so that we could clearly lay out the expectations for the board and what potential board members were agreeing to when we went out to recruit board members and ask them to be a part of the organization. You can also check with your state arts agencies. Sometimes they have people on staff who have led workshops on board development or strategic planning, and they may be willing to come out and do some sort of training or planning with your organization as part of the services that they provide. The other, another idea is to check with other nonprofits in your community. If there's enough of an interest, it may be worth getting together all of those different organizations and bring out an entity or a consultant to do board trainings for multiple organizations. The nice thing about that is that you'll have healthier boards and all of the organizations that are involved, and that you're going to know some people that the people that participate are going to make excellent candidates for your own district leadership because they'll have been through that. The main thing I would underline is don't hesitate to ask for advice. Are there organizations in your community that you respect? Ask to sit down with their board president or their director if they have one and ask for their advice. How did they learn how to be a healthy board? Do they see themselves as a healthy board? And what do they consider as one of the most important things that they do? And you know, one of the biggest takeaways that I have seen from various resources is to ask questions. Ask questions of yourself, of your board, and of other organizations. Be willing to be flexible and adapt to your organization's changing needs. Just because you've done something one way for a long time doesn't mean that there's another way to do it effectively. And it doesn't mean that those things are going to change. You may start out as a not all volunteer-led board. You end up hiring someone. How does that change the dynamics and the expectations of those board members? And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Annette to talk about involving new members.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So yeah, we're going to talk about getting new folks involved to make sure your district is sustainable over time, and then also we're going to talk a little bit about what happens when there's a leadership change with some of your partners and how to navigate through that. So Rachel obviously just talked a lot about board development, and so this is something you definitely need to pay attention to. Your board should not be made up of the same people year after year after year. Unless the board is particularly open-minded or flexible, this is just going to contribute to stagnation within your district. And also, more importantly than that, it's exclusionary and it doesn't allow for new voices to be at the table. So you should always be on the lookout for that. Looking at people who are interested, not just your friends, but also people who have a particular skill set as well. So partnership development and recruitment should be a long-term focus of your district and built into all of the activities that you do. And when you're trying to involve new partners, such as tribes or colleges, for example, know that you're building relationships and that they can take time. And don't come at them directly with an ask, especially for money right off the bat, right? You want to come with them with an offer or something that you can bring to them. And you need to be respectful of their norms and of their time and be open and humble to the fact that they do things differently from you, and that is okay. Right. Now, in some of our districts, the city runs the district, often in partnership with local nonprofits who do a part of the work. And the great thing about this model is that, cities are obviously identifiable, but everybody knows who the city is, and they tend to be relatively stable organizations over time. But one of the challenges is that cities and governments in general tend to be relatively risk averse and process oriented. So some initiatives and efforts can take longer. And so this is where clear roles and expectations are key. And the city can leave some of the more experimental ideas to the community partners, and then they can focus on what they need to focus on related to infrastructure and that sort of thing. Now, if you run into some challenges with an us versus them kind of mentality with dealing with, the government folks, or if people out there don't want to partner with the city, that can be challenging, right? And so if the city is the administrator, they may have to be okay with ceding some of that decision making to their partners, or even maybe turning over administration to a local partner and be in more of a support role. Again, this is going to require trust and cooperation for this to work long term for the health and the continuity of your creative district. So, what happens when you run into a leadership change at the city, for example, either with elected officials or with staff turnover? And how do you approach this? In the case of elected officials, we recommend having conversations about the district early on, even before they're elected, right? So don't come at them with a we need your support mentality, but more about let's talk about what the district is doing for the community. And we'd love to get to know what your thoughts are and ideas are for that and how we can support your potential goals. Again, it's building relationships. And if you can get people to understand the importance of the creative district and the work that you're doing, oftentimes they will get on board. And if they don't, they're not going to necessarily be as obstructionist as they might be if you came at them with an ask right off the bat. If it's staffers that are changing, oftentimes their work duties are already built into the roles. So to a certain degree, they have to be bought in, right? But you shouldn't assume that, of course. And so again, it's about relationship building, demonstrating benefit, how the creative district can support their goals in the work that they're doing at the city is going to be important. And it's also important to recognize that they may have ideas as well and may have thoughts about what can be done, and they should be incorporated into the planning and into the work that you're doing. So the idea of a change in city or staff or board should be built into your long-term planning and succession planning from the very beginning. So using a SWOT analysis, a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats analysis could be a good tool for you to help think about how to do this, right? Because that can be considered a threat to the work that you're doing. Something that's important to recognize is that change is inevitable and you will have to navigate through it regardless. So knowing that this is going to be happening at some point from the very beginning, knowing that that's a possibility will help make it less painful when it occurs. So planning and forward thinking are the key to ensuring that your organizational structure can handle whatever comes its way. So we have about 5 minutes left, and we are going to go ahead and take some questions. So if folks have specific questions, please use the raise hand feature, and we will try to go ahead and get folks in order, or as many of them as we can in the remaining time that we have.
And that we did have some come in through the Q&A or through the chat. I know one came in asking about the IPI study, and yes, I can make sure that everybody gets a link to that. It's a PDF for that study, so you can have that.
Right.
And then I believe this might have been for you, Rachel, about an estimate on cost for an audit. I don't know if you might happen to know that, or Annette, maybe you.
Are they talking about a government audit? Are they talking about a nonprofit audit?
That's a fantastic question.
It's from
George,
George Sharp. So George, I
Yeah.
know George. So George,
For a nonprofit, we have one going through that right now, so down
oh,
there.
interesting. And I presume that they're hiring a third party to do their
Yes.
audit for them, to do the certification audit. Interesting. I honestly don't know what a cost for that would be. I could tell you that if you wanted to know, Washington nonprofits would be a good place, or 501 Commons. They could answer those kinds of questions, and may even be able to point of folks in the right direction here in Washington as to who is an organization that can do that for them.
Thank you, Annette.
Yeah, you bet. That's a great question.
and then we
Okay.
did have another question come in about regarding sustainability outside of best practices. And today we kind of reference sustainability in the sense of the succession planning topic, and how succession planning can lead to a more sustainable organization. But if that is a topic for related to creative districts that you want to dive into even more of a deep dive, then I think that's something that we could really put on a future webinar series for you all. Which is a question before you hang up today, is if there is other information, something that you really want to dive into regarding creative districts, please put that in the chat for us. And that way, when we're kind of coming up with our ideas, we can make sure that we're creating content that's good for you. And I see Tammy's got a question.
Hello, and I have a call coming up with Rachel, but I had written down, you had made the comment about, if you're considering a paid staff for the 5-year plan, you said 10 hours a week at $20 an hour is not really enough. Does that mean it's not a high enough pay considering it's usually a more skilled person? Or does that mean whoever the person is working on this, that you think it's going to take more than 10 hours a week for them to lead the effort?
A little bit of both. And I mean, also, you have to recognize that pay scales are different in different states.
Sure.
Washington is a very high cost of living area, and pay tends to be a lot higher than in a lot of other regions. What we've seen over time, what we've seen over time from our districts who've been around for several years, is that the amount of work and focus that they have to put on their creative districts increases over time, particularly as they start to get more funding. Particularly here in Washington, we have capital funding for capital projects. They have to manage those kinds of grants. And so work creeps after a time, right? The
Sure,
amount of work
sure.
that happens as equals the amount of time that's allotted to it. And so, we do want to encourage people to think of this as a higher level type of position. You're not necessarily going to be hiring a person who's fresh out of school. They don't have that kind of some of that context and experience around how do you do these large community development programs. And so there is a little bit of that. We have found that, 10 weeks or 10 hours a week is good in the beginning, but that ends up not being it over the long term. We have, like I said, a couple of districts. One started with a half-time FTE at a city, and that's increased over time. And then another couple of our organizations are looking at putting in full-time people right off the bat and seeing what that looks like. So, and then if you're going to have a full-time person, they need to have benefits and all of those other kinds of things as well. So we do encourage folks to think about that long-term planning as what that looks like.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm at the very beginning stages. So this whole conversation is really helpful in framing that. Thank you.
Excellent. That was a great question. Thanks for that. Are there any other quick questions? We're at 2:30 right now, so we want to be respectful of folks' time.
There was a couple of questions specifically regarding Idaho, and Tilly, I will follow up with you on that one. But then also there was a great recommendation or a suggestion that if a board member is stepping down, could they take on a mentorship role? And I think that's a really beautiful succession plan, a transition plan of how do they step out of that role and be able to transition their knowledge back into the organization without walking away with that. So that's I think a really great idea and suggestion that was shared. But I do believe that was the last one that specifically came in, and thank you for those that are popping in other topics into the chat. This is fantastic. So many great ideas.
All right, awesome. So we're gonna shut it down for today, everybody. I think we probably are gonna end up doing another webinar here at some point in the relatively near future. We know funding sustainability is a huge topic for folks, and it kind of is all over the place. And so I think that's something we'll be wanting to talk about is some of that long-term sustainability, not so much from a governance perspective, but more from the financial perspective as well. So for those of you that joined, or if you want to be able to get links to these videos, we're going to be sending them out. We'll be sending out some other links as well here to all the folks who attended, but then also those who registered and weren't able to join us. And be on the lookout for more information from us about upcoming webinars in the future. On behalf of Allison and Rachel, thank you all for your time. We appreciate it, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.